We can expect in the future that more people will be carrying handguns on the streets in places like Los Angeles, Boston, and New York City.
Rhyme says the Missouri law exposes people to greater harm by interfering with the federal government's ability to enforce firearms regulations.
Atlanta, Buffalo, Uvalde. And for the shootings that happen every day in the street that are mass shootings we don't even hear about.
Giving domestic violence abusers a license to kill and essentially preventing the government from doing anything at all about it.
You gave testimony that the brave ATF agents are the ones showing up at 2 in the morning after a burglary.
The backdrop. The case under discussion today revolves around the constitutionality of the ban of fatal weapons and large-capacity mags in the state of Illinois. Recently, oral arguments were held in the Seventh Circuit, where the legal merits and implications of these bans were extensively debated. The outcome of this case has significant implications for gun rights and Second Amendment protections. A crucial factor in understanding this case is the Supreme Court's ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin.
Blatantly denying the power grab being carried out by the executive branch yet again.
The uptick in violence has just been astronomical. The gun violence.
As a kid, I came out of a different movement, the civil rights movement.
Who showed up here said one thing that felt good about doing this kind of event was that they felt empowered.
Pretty clear about the extent to which this is an abuse of the Administrative Procedures Act.
Is it a difficult question to understand?
I'm sure it's enormously high.
It's 36 per 100,000 people.
I just felt that I needed to be able to protect myself.
This ruling, handed down recently, has relevance to the present legal challenge in Illinois. The Bruin decision emphasized the importance of the Second Amendment and clarified certain aspects related to gun ownership and regulations. It is important to note that the judges presiding over the oral arguments in the Seventh Circuit have demonstrated a clear bias against firearms. Their preconceived notions and disdain for the Second Amendment and previous Supreme Court decisions related to gun rights have been evident throughout the proceedings. This bias could potentially influence their interpretation and decision-making in this case. The weapons ban in Illinois, along with the prohibition on large-capacity mags, forms the core of the challenged laws. These measures were enacted by the state government under the guise of public safety concerns and the prevention of mass casualty events. The state's attorneys defending the bans have argued that these firearms are dangerous and unusual, making their possession and use detrimental to the well-being of the public. The plaintiffs, on the other hand, have raised significant constitutional concerns regarding these bans. They argue that the restrictions imposed on fatal weapons and large-capacity mags infringe upon the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens.
And having to tell her that other 9-year-olds were just killed in a shooting is horrific.
Get on the ground now!
I'm a federal agent.
917-110-3.
I'm a federal agent.
Get on the ground!
Real background checks could stop a lot of illegal guns going in different places in the country.
This shall not be infringed, and the word infringe means by banning parts on firearms actually is against the Constitution.
Affect us here, and it was such a breath of fresh air for the Second Amendment people.
It takes extraordinary courage for them to stand up here and retell the story.
Anti-gunners put in there to keep the guns out of the hands of lawful citizens in New York State.
They contend that the bans are not consistent with the Supreme Court's precedent, including the Bruin decision, which emphasizes the protection of arms in common use for lawful purposes. The initial ruling in this case resulted in a preliminary injunction against the enforcement of the weapons ban and the ban on large-capacity mags. This temporary halt on the law's enforcement was based on the finding that the bans were inconsistent with the Supreme Court's recent rulings, including Bruin. However, the state of Illinois was dissatisfied with this ruling and sought an emergency stay from the Seventh Circuit to reverse the injunction. The Seventh Circuit granted the emergency stay, effectively reinstating the enforcement of the bans while the legal proceedings continue. This decision raised concerns among those who believe in the protection of Second Amendment rights, as it appeared to favor the state's position and demonstrated the uphill battle faced by the plaintiffs challenging the bans. The presence of bias against firearms among the judges on the panel is an important consideration in this case. Their clear disdain for the Second Amendment and the Supreme Court's decisions, particularly the Bruin ruling, has created a challenging environment for those advocating for the protection of gun rights. It remains to be seen how this bias will impact the final decision and the overall fairness of the legal process. Oral arguments in the Seventh Circuit. During the oral arguments in the Seventh Circuit, the plaintiffs challenging the ban on weapons and large-capacity mags presented compelling arguments to support their case. They emphasized the infringement upon their Second Amendment rights and contended that the bans were not consistent with the Supreme Court's precedents. The plaintiffs' main contention centered around the fundamental right to bear arms, protected by the Second Amendment. They argued that the bans on fatal weapons and large-capacity mags unconstitutionally restricted law-abiding citizens from exercising their right to self-defense and owning firearms commonly used for lawful purposes. They invoked the Supreme Court's landmark decision in District of Columbia v. Heller, which affirmed an individual's right to possess firearms for self-defense within the home, as well as the more recent Bruin decision, which emphasized the protection of arms in common use. The plaintiffs also challenged the state's argument that weapons and large-capacity mags are dangerous and unusual. They argued that these firearms are widely used by law-abiding citizens for various legitimate purposes, such as self-defense, recreational shooting, and competitive sports. They further contended that the bans disproportionately impacted law-abiding citizens while doing little to address the root causes of criminal activity. On the other side, the state's attorneys defending the bans presented arguments aimed at justifying the restrictions on weapons and large-capacity mags.
To run enhanced background checks on young people under 21 trying to buy a firearm.
This government can protect its own people, except for 36 out of every 100,000 for murders.
Types of disputes that would be settled by people yelling at each other, maybe engaging in a fist fight, are being settled with guns.
I'm just inspired by the next generation. I think it's a time for a big change.
Since you rewrote the rules of asylum based on the perceived degree of violence in these countries.
Selling more guns in the last 3 weeks than we did in the last 8 months.
But for me, and for most of you, here's what it really is. It's an important first step.
When somebody bump fires, think of this as a bump fire stock and able to move.
To be clear, this wasn't based on violence. This is based on threats specifically to individuals, on gangs.
They contended that these firearms pose significant dangers to public safety and were often used in mass casualty events. The state's attorneys sought to emphasize the state's interest in preventing such incidents and protecting the well-being of the public. To support their position, the state's attorneys relied on an interest-balancing approach, despite the Supreme Court's rejection of this approach in the Bruin decision. They argued that the bans were necessary to strike a balance between public safety and individual rights. However, this approach was challenged by the plaintiffs, who argued that the Supreme Court's precedent clearly established that arms in common use for lawful purposes should receive strong protection, without subjecting them to interest-balancing tests. Throughout the oral arguments, notable exchanges and contentions arose between the judges and the attorneys. The judges posed challenging questions to both sides, probing the limits and implications of the Second Amendment and the Supreme Court's precedents. The judges' questions often focused on the nature of the banned firearms, their prevalence among law-abiding citizens, and their potential use in criminal activities. Some judges displayed skepticism towards the plaintiffs' arguments, particularly regarding the characterization of fatal weapons and large-capacity mags as arms protected by the Second Amendment. They questioned whether these firearms fell within the scope of the right to bear arms, as envisioned by the framers of the Constitution. This skepticism raised concerns among supporters of gun rights, as it suggested a potential inclination of the judges to interpret the Second Amendment narrowly.
Today, we say more than enough. We say more than enough.
No Democrat has ever tried to get anybody's guns. I mean, that's just a lie that they tell, and y'all ought to stop perpetuating the lie.
If we can reach compromise on guns, we ought to be able to reach compromise on other critical issues, from veterans' health care.
To have their firearms, which are being held by the government, transferred to a third party for the third party to sell.
Atlanta, Buffalo, Uvalde. And for the shootings that happen every day in the street that are mass shootings we don't even hear about.
Judges' bias and disdain for firearms. The oral arguments in the Seventh Circuit revealed a clear bias among the judges on the panel against firearms and a negative stance towards the Second Amendment and the Supreme Court's decisions related to gun rights. This bias was evident through the judges' statements and behavior during the proceedings, which raised concerns about the fairness and impartiality of the case. Throughout the arguments, the judges made remarks and posed questions that indicated their preconceived notions and disdain for firearms. These comments and inquiries often focused on downplaying the significance of the Second Amendment and challenging the protections afforded to gun owners. The judges' negative attitude towards the Second Amendment became apparent through their skepticism regarding the inclusion of certain firearms, such as lethal weapons and large-capacity mags, within the scope of protected arms. Their dismissive attitude towards the Supreme Court's decisions further showcased their bias. For example, one of the judges referred to the Supreme Court's ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin as an analysis circular, suggesting a lack of respect for the court's reasoning and conclusions.
We are not finished. We are not finished. We are not finished.
The submitted firearm brace, when attached to a firearm, does not convert that weapon to be fired from the shoulder and would not alter the classification.
Not one more! Not one more! Not one more!
Distribution of 10 to 40 million of these braces and the implementation of your rule. Did Congress pass a law?
This display of disregard for the highest court's decisions raises concerns about the judge's willingness to adhere to established legal precedents. The judge's bias against firearms and their negative stance towards the Second Amendment have significant implications for the outcome of the case. An inherent bias may influence their interpretation of the law and their willingness to give proper weight to the plaintiff's arguments advocating for the protection of Second Amendment rights. It raises concerns about whether the judges will approach the case with an open mind and apply the law impartially. The presence of bias can undermine the overall fairness of the proceedings. It is crucial for judges to approach each case with objectivity and without predetermined inclinations. The evident bias displayed by the judges may create an atmosphere where the plaintiffs challenging the ban face an uphill battle to present their case effectively and receive a fair hearing. The perception of bias erodes public confidence in the judiciary and may lead to skepticism about the impartiality of the final decision. Given the significance of the Second Amendment and its implications for individual rights, it is essential that judges approach cases involving gun rights with fairness and without preconceived biases. The presence of a biased judiciary threatens the integrity of the legal system and the protection of constitutional rights. It is incumbent upon judges to set aside personal opinions and uphold the principles of fairness and impartiality throughout the proceedings. It is important to note that while bias may be evident during oral arguments, the final decision could still reflect a fair and unbiased analysis of the law. Judges are expected to separate personal beliefs from their role as impartial arbiters of justice. However, the presence of bias during the oral arguments raises concerns and highlights the need for vigilance in ensuring that the final decision is based on a thorough and objective analysis of the legal merits.
I don't really see the purpose of letting other people that don't really know what harm they can do.
You specifically said that.
But I said...
What does mandatory mean?
I'm trying to say that...
Does it mean that prosecutors get a choice?
I would expect to see in the coming months and years is a lot of focus on whether or not enough places are deemed sensitive right now.
The Attorney General himself, Ken Paxton, tweeted saying, quote, "What we just witnessed is illegal."
Challenged Illinois state laws and city ordinances. The case at hand centers around the challenge to specific laws and ordinances in Illinois, namely the lethal weapons ban and the ban on large-capacity mags. These measures have been the subject of intense debate and legal scrutiny. The weapons ban in Illinois prohibits the possession, sale, and transfer of certain firearms that are categorized as fatal weapons. These include firearms such as AR-15 rifles and other semi-auto rifles with specific features, which are deemed to possess characteristics associated with military-style firearms. The ban aims to restrict the availability and use of these firearms in the state. Similarly, the ban on large-capacity mags in Illinois restricts the possession and sale of mags capable of holding more than a specified number of rounds. The intention behind this ban is to limit the capacity of firearms to fire multiple rounds without reloading, thereby reducing the potential for mass incidents or other violent incidents. The state's attorneys defending these bans have put forth public safety concerns as the primary rationale behind these measures. They argue that fatal weapons and large-capacity mags pose significant dangers to society and are often used in mass casualty events. The The state's attorneys contend that by restricting access to these firearms and accessories, they aim to prevent such incidents and protect the well-being of the public. It is worth considering the political context surrounding these laws and ordinances.
So the third party can either keep them in trust or sell them and give the money to Mr. Henderson.
James commented on the decision, saying she's pleased. Remember, the law as it stands strengthens requirements.
And in many cases, the value of the firearms can be quite high.
Today for the most significant law to be passed since then, since the last 30 years.
And prohibits guns in sensitive places and requires background checks on all ammunition purchases.
Statute means what it says. It says that a convicted felon cannot possess a firearm.
I'd like to thank the leaders and members of the House and Senate for working together to get this done. I especially want to thank the families.
It doesn't say he can't sell a firearm that the government is possessing on his behalf.
The enactment of the fatal weapons ban and the ban on large capacity mags in Illinois reflects the state's efforts to address public safety concerns and respond to high-profile incidents involving firearms. These measures have gained support from proponents who believe that stricter regulations on firearms will contribute to reducing gun violence and ensuring public safety. However, it is important to note that the challenged laws and ordinances have faced legal challenges in the past. Similar bans on fatal weapons and large capacity mags have been the subject of judicial scrutiny in various jurisdictions across the U.S. Legal arguments often revolve around the interpretation of the Second Amendment and its application to the regulation of firearms. Opponents of these bans argue that they infringe upon the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens. They contend that these firearms and accessories are commonly used for lawful purposes, such as self-defense, recreational shooting, and competitive sports. Critics of the bans emphasize that they disproportionately impact responsible gun owners and fail to address the root causes of criminal activity.
Because he doesn't care about separation of powers either.
The Texas House of Representatives just voted to impeach Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton.
How many guns has the ATF lost? I'm not sure I understand the question.
But what is also true is that it is incumbent upon the United States Congress, the House of Representatives in particular.
Wyme says the Missouri law exposes people to greater harm by interfering with the federal government's ability to enforce firearms regulations.
The extent to which this is an unconstitutional violation of our Second Amendment rights.
Preliminary injunction and emergency stay. After legal proceedings commenced, a significant development occurred when a judge granted a preliminary injunction against the enforcement of the ban on weapons and large-capacity mags in Illinois. This injunction temporarily halted the implementation of the bans until a final decision could be reached regarding their constitutionality. The granting of the preliminary injunction was a noteworthy victory for the plaintiffs challenging the bans. It signaled that the court recognized the potential merit of their arguments and deemed it appropriate to suspend the enforcement of the bans pending further legal analysis. This ruling provided some respite for those who opposed the restrictions on Second Amendment rights. However, the state of Illinois expressed dissatisfaction with the preliminary injunction and sought an appeal to the Seventh Circuit. The state's attorneys argued that the bans were necessary for public safety and that the injunction impeded their ability to enforce measures aimed at preventing mass casualty events. They contended that allowing the bans to remain suspended could potentially jeopardize the well-being of the public. In response to the state's appeal, the Seventh Circuit granted an emergency stay, effectively reinstating the enforcement of the bans while the legal proceedings continued. The decision to grant the emergency stay was based on the court's assessment that the state's interest in public safety outweighed the potential harm caused by continuing the enforcement of the bans.
Conventional wisdom was we would never get any Republicans to support gun legislation, period.
Are ones where, in fact, it's most likely that they should be bringing the highest and mandatory minimum.
Details of the law, but folks, listen at home. Here's a quick summary of what this law is doing. It's already allowing.
Demonstrating that blind loyalty to Speaker Dade Phelan is more important than upholding their oath of office.
Might end up being a message amendment because the President of the United States will almost assuredly veto it.
This decision dealt a blow to those challenging the bans, as it meant that the restrictions would remain in effect until a final decision was reached. The granting of the emergency stay signaled a potential setback for those advocating for the protection of Second Amendment rights. It underscored the court's recognition of the state's arguments regarding public safety concerns and their authority to implement measures aimed at addressing such concerns. The emergency stay also demonstrated the court's willingness to suspend the preliminary injunction in favor of the state's interests. The reinstatement of the ban's enforcement during the ongoing legal proceedings created a challenging environment for the plaintiffs. It placed additional burdens on those who desired to exercise their Second Amendment rights by limiting their access to certain firearms and accessories. Additionally, it increased the urgency and stakes of the case as the enforcement of the bans continued while the legal battle unfolded. The decision to grant the emergency stay emphasized the delicate balance between individual rights and public safety considerations. It highlighted the court's role in evaluating the potential harm caused by the enforcement or suspension of the bans and weighing it against the state's interest in protecting the well-being of the public. This balance would play a crucial role in the final determination of the case's outcome.
That requirement for showing a heightened need for self-defense, that was the teeth of these permitting laws.
And within less than 15 minutes, you can walk out the front door here with a rifle or a shotgun.
American citizens in places like New Orleans and Baltimore and St. Louis begin to seek asylum in countries like Honduras and Guatemala.
I don't know if you're referring to any particular incident.
The granting of the preliminary injunction and subsequent emergency stay demonstrated the dynamic nature of the legal proceedings surrounding the ban on lethal weapons and large-capacity mags in Illinois. These rulings had immediate consequences, temporarily halting the enforcement of the bans, only to be followed by the reinstatement of their enforcement through the emergency stay. The legal battle would now continue, with the court ultimately tasked with determining the ban's constitutionality and their impact on Second Amendment rights. The outcome of the case would have significant implications for both proponents and opponents of the bans. It would shape the future of gun control measures in Illinois and potentially influence similar regulations in other jurisdictions. The final decision reached by the court would provide clarity on the extent to which Second Amendment rights can be restricted and the legal boundaries within each state governments can operate in relation to firearm regulations.
Because they like the outcome of the policy. The banning of a piece of plastic.
Post-Bruen challenges have succeeded in lower courts. The opinions and reasonings therein have been grossly mischaracterized.
Obviously, they're gone, but will be an inspiration for us to do more. I'm not going to sign this bill into law.
Circuit decision in U.S. v. Rahimi is worth highlighting. As others have noted, the panel struck down a federal statute.
The role of Supreme Court's Bruen decision. The Supreme Court's ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruen holds significant importance in the present case challenging the ban on fatal weapons and large-capacity mags in Illinois. The Bruen decision established key principles that are relevant to the interpretation of the Second Amendment and the constitutionality of firearm regulations. One critical principle highlighted in Bruen is the rejection of interest balancing. The court made it clear that courts should not engage in a balancing test that weighs the government's interest in public safety against an individual's Second Amendment rights. Instead, the court emphasized that arms in common use for lawful purposes are entitled to strong protection under the Second Amendment. The Bruen decision also affirmed the importance of considering arms in common use for lawful purposes.
I don't have a gun, but I don't give a damn about anybody else having one.
The most serious readily provable offenses in cases where mandatory minimums are present because it's not warranted.
Giving domestic violence abusers a license to kill and essentially preventing the government from doing anything at all about it.
What changed is that item that was submitted was not produced and was not the item that was marketed.
The government quite properly charged him with several crimes.
The sensitive places doctrine was not at issue in this case and still exists.
But then it released him, apparently believing that a civil restraining order instead of pretrial detention was the best way.
He went on to say he looks forward to a quick resolution in the Texas Senate.
Predictably, Mr. Rahimi soon thought, to hell with your restraining order.
Who are prepared and carry a gun oftentimes have to make split-second decisions.
Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon against a different woman using a gun that he wasn't legally allowed to own, but obtained anyway.
It emphasized that firearms that are commonly owned and used by law-abiding citizens for self-defense and other legitimate purposes fall within the scope of Second Amendment protections. This recognition of common use as a significant factor in evaluating the constitutionality of firearms regulations has implications for the present case challenging the bans in Illinois. During the oral arguments in the Seventh Circuit, it is important to evaluate how the judges on the panel reacted to the principles outlined in the Bruin decision. Did they appear inclined to follow or reject its principles? While each judge's specific stance may vary, it is worth noting that the judges displayed varying degrees of skepticism and even disdain for the Bruin decision. Some judges characterized the decision as an analysis circular and openly expressed their disregard for the reasoning and conclusions put forth by the Supreme Court in Bruin. This display of skepticism and rejection raises concerns about the judges' willingness to adhere to established legal precedents and their commitment to upholding Second Amendment protections. The judge's response to the Bruin decision during the oral arguments has significant implications for the outcome of the case. If the judges display a clear rejection of the Bruin decision and its principles, it may suggest that they are inclined to uphold the bans in Illinois, despite the Supreme Court's recent ruling. Such a disposition would raise concerns among supporters of Second Amendment rights and potentially undermine the integrity of the judicial process. On the other hand, if the judges show a willingness to follow the principles established in Bruin, it would provide hope for those challenging the bans. It would signal a recognition of the importance of common use and the limited authority of interest balancing in evaluating the constitutionality of firearms regulations. Such an approach would align with the Supreme Court's recent rulings and reinforce the protection of Second Amendment rights. The ultimate decision of the judges will shape the outcome of the case and set a precedent for future challenges of firearm regulations. Their adherence or rejection of the Bruin decision will have lasting implications for the interpretation and application of the Second Amendment. It will determine the extent to which the Supreme Court's precedents are respected and whether the principles established in Bruin are embraced or disregarded in the context of the bans in Illinois. States' attorneys' arguments for the ban. The state's attorneys defending the ban on lethal weapons and large-capacity mags in Illinois put forth several arguments to justify the restrictions. Their primary contention is that these firearms are dangerous and unusual, and their usage is associated with mass casualty events. By characterizing these firearms as exceptional in terms of their capacity for harm, the state's attorneys aim to establish a basis for the constitutionality of the bans. To support their argument, the state's attorneys emphasize public safety concerns. They contend that these firearms pose significant dangers to society and are often used in mass incidents and other violent incidents. By restricting access to fatal weapons and large-capacity mags, they assert that the state is taking necessary measures to safeguard public well-being and prevent further tragedies. The state's attorneys rely on the assertion that the ban is motivated by the state's interest in preventing mass casualty events. They contend that these firearms, due to their capabilities and features, are particularly suited for inflicting harm on a large scale. By associating the banned firearms with such incidents, the state's attorneys seek to establish a compelling state interest that justifies the restrictions.
That Bruin is a thing from which the public must be protected. This is simply not true.
So other families will not have the experience and the pain and trauma that they had to live through.
For too long, states like New York told millions of citizens that their right to armed self-defense ended the moment they left their homes.
She proves you can run for office ending gun violence in the South and you can win.
Lawful gun owners are not the driving force behind criminal gun violence, and this is particularly true of concealed carry permit holders.
AK-47 is an automatic Kalashnikov model of 1947.
At the same time, as I outline in much greater detail in my written submission, they play a significant but underappreciated role.
You can prevent the next tragedy. You can save life. You can save families in the process.
Another argument put forth by the state's attorneys is that the ban is consistent with the Supreme Court's precedents, including the Bruin decision. They contend that the bans align with the court's recognition of the government's authority to regulate firearms in the interest of public safety. They argue that the state's interest in protecting its citizens and preventing mass incidents overrides any potential infringement on Second Amendment rights. In their attempt to justify the ban, the state's attorneys advocate for the constitutionality of the measures through an interest-balancing approach. Despite the Supreme Court's rejection of interest balancing in the Bruin decision, the state's attorneys argue that it is still relevant to consider the government's interest in public safety and the prevention of mass casualty events. They assert that the bans are a reasonable and necessary regulation that strikes a balance between individual rights and the well-being of the public. Critics of the state's arguments argue that the bans are not consistent with the Supreme Court's precedents. They contend that the Second Amendment protects the rights of individuals to possess firearms that are commonly used for lawful purposes, including self-defense. They argue that fatal weapons and large-capacity mags are widely owned and used by law-abiding citizens for legitimate purposes, undermining the claim that they are dangerous and unusual. Opponents of the bans argue that the restrictions disproportionately impact responsible gun owners without effectively addressing the root causes of criminal activity. They contend that the focus should be on enforcing existing laws, enhancing mental health services, and addressing societal factors contributing to violence, rather than implementing broad bans that restrict the rights of law-abiding citizens. Judges ignoring clear Supreme Court statements. During the oral arguments in the Seventh Court, it became evident that the judges showed a disregard for or ignored clear statements made by the Supreme Court in previous rulings, particularly in Heller and Bruin. This disregard for the Supreme Court's guidance raises concerns about the consistency and integrity of legal interpretations in the present case. One notable example of the judges' dismissal of Supreme Court statements is their treatment of the dangerous and unusual analysis. In Bruin, the Supreme Court emphasized that the appropriate analysis when evaluating the constitutionality of firearm regulations is to consider whether the arms in question are dangerous and unusual. However, during the oral arguments, one judge referred to it as a dangerous/unusual test, demonstrating a lack of attentiveness to the precise language and requirements set forth by the Supreme Court. Furthermore, the judges seemed to overlook the Supreme Court's explicit statements regarding the protection of arms in common use for lawful purposes.
Inventing the pistol stabilizing brace to help his friend, a disabled combat veteran, at the shooting range.
You gave testimony that the brave ATF agents are the ones showing up at 2 in the morning after a burglary.
Do any of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle give a whit about separation of powers?
Connecticut delegation, which is incredible. I think on this issue and many others, you're the best delegation in the United States.
No guns were lost. They were stolen by an individual who's now in prison.
And of course, we've got a lot of criticism over this. So why is it not a machine gun?
In areas that are poor, mostly minority, there's a mass shooting.
Congress wants to change the law and come up with a new interpretation, then ATF will follow that new interpretation.
In Heller, the court affirmed that firearms that are commonly owned and used for lawful purposes are entitled to strong protection under the Second Amendment. However, the judges in the present case question the common ownership of certain firearms, such as AR-15 rifles, and even cast doubt on the significance of statistical data provided to support the prevalence of these firearms among law-abiding citizens. This disregard for clear Supreme Court statements raises concerns about their commitment to upholding established legal principles. The judge's failure to acknowledge or properly address the Supreme Court's reasoning in Heller and Bruin is troubling. These decisions established fundamental principles that shape the interpretation and application of the Second Amendment. Disregarding the Supreme Court's guidance undermines the consistency and integrity of legal interpretations, as it allows personal opinions and biases to overshadow the binding precedents set by the highest court in the land. The judge's disregard for clear Supreme Court statements can have broader implications for Second Amendment jurisprudence. The Supreme Court's rulings serve as a foundation for lower courts when evaluating the constitutionality of firearms regulations. When judges fail to engage with and apply these precedents faithfully, it erodes the predictability and coherence of the law. It also introduces inconsistency in how the Second Amendment is interpreted and applied across different jurisdictions, potentially leading to contradictory outcomes in similar cases. The role of judges is to impartially apply the law and faithfully interpret the Constitution. This requires a genuine effort to engage with and respect the precedents set by the Supreme Court. Disregarding or ignoring clear statements made by the highest court undermines the legitimacy of the judicial process and raises concerns about the fairness and impartiality of the proceedings. Focus on arms not relevant to the case. During the oral arguments in the Seventh Circuit, it became apparent that the judges focused on arms that were not relevant to the case at hand, diverting attention from the specific firearms and accessories being challenged. This diversionary tactic raises concerns about the judges' commitment to addressing the core issues and their willingness to confront the arguments directly related to the bans on fatal weapons and large-capacity mags. One instance of this diversionary focus was the judges' repeated references to mash guns, grenades, and other arms that were not at issue in the present case. By bringing up these unrelated items, the judges seemed to create a diversion from the actual firearms and accessories being challenged, such as AR-15 rifles and large-capacity mags. This diversionary tactic may serve to downplay the significance of the bans and undermine the plaintiffs' arguments challenging their constitutionality.
June of 2021, you changed the department's asylum rules so that it could apply to individuals with significant gang violence.
Most apparent here a defense of the Second Amendment, which this most certainly is.
We can expect in the future that more people will be carrying handguns on the streets in places like Los Angeles, Boston, and New York City.
As many of you out there, either parents, relatives, and/or victims yourself.
Furthermore, by shifting the focus to unrelated arms, the judges potentially aimed to create an atmosphere where the plaintiff's claims appeared less compelling. By highlighting the most extreme and dangerous arms, the judges may have attempted to create a false equivalence between the firearms at issue in the case and those that are universally recognized as highly regulated or illegal. This tactic could potentially diminish the perceived significance of the bans on fatal weapons and large-capacity mags and downplay the impact on the exercise of Second Amendment rights. It is important to note that this diversionary focus may also reflect a misunderstanding of the specific firearms and accessories being challenged. The judge's references to mash guns and grenades, in the context of the bans on weapons and large-capacity mags, demonstrate a lack of clarity regarding the characteristics and capabilities of the firearms under scrutiny. This lack of understanding may further raise concerns about the judge's ability to make informed decisions regarding the bans and their impact on Second Amendment rights. This diversionary focus on unrelated arms may undermine the effectiveness of the plaintiff's arguments. By sidestepping the central issues and focusing on arms that are not at the heart of the case, the judges may have hindered the plaintiff's ability to present their case effectively and highlight the constitutionally protected nature of the firearms being challenged. This diversionary tactic potentially disadvantaged the plaintiffs and weakened their position in the proceedings. The judge's diversionary focus on unrelated arms underscores the need for a focused and precise analysis of the specific firearms and accessories at issue in the case. It is essential for judges to engage directly with the arguments and evidence presented by the parties and address the constitutionality of the bans on lethal weapons and large-capacity mags based on their merits. Failure to do so not only undermines the fairness of the proceedings, but also calls into question the judge's commitment to upholding the principles of justice and protecting individual rights. Potential outcome and further legal options. The divergent approaches, biases, and potential disregard for Supreme Court statements displayed by the judges during the oral arguments raises questions about the potential outcome of the case, challenging the bans on fatal weapons and large-capacity mags in Illinois. While it is challenging to predict the precise outcome, several scenarios and further legal options can be considered. Given the judge's bias and apparent resistance to the Supreme Court's recent ruling in Bruin, it is possible that they may rule in favor of upholding the bans. If the judges align with their expressed disdain for firearms and disregard the precedents set by the Supreme Court, they may interpret the bans as constitutional and reject the arguments put forth by the plaintiffs. This outcome would be disappointing for those advocating for the protection of Second Amendment rights and may reinforce concerns about judicial impartiality and the consistency of legal interpretations. In the event that the bans are upheld, the plaintiffs would have several legal options to pursue further. One option would be to seek an en banc review within the Seventh Circuit. This involves requesting a rehearing of the case before all active judges on the circuit, rather than just the three-judge panel that initially heard the oral arguments. The en banc review provides an opportunity to present the case to a larger panel of judges and potentially receive a different outcome. However, securing an en banc review is challenging, as it typically requires a majority of the circuit's active judges to vote in favor of the review. Another potential legal option for the plaintiffs would be to appeal the decision directly to the Supreme Court. This would involve petitioning the highest court in the land to review the case and provide a definitive ruling on the constitutionality of the bans. However, the Supreme Court receives numerous petitions for review, and it is highly selective in choosing cases to hear. The court may consider factors such as the significance of the legal issues involved and the presence of a conflict between different circuit courts' interpretations of the law. Whether the court decides to grant certiorari and hear the case would depend on its assessment of the factors. If the plaintiffs choose to pursue an appeal to the Supreme Court, it would provide an opportunity for the court to clarify and reinforce its precedents in Heller and Bruin. The court could use this case as a means to reiterate the importance of adhering to established legal principles and to provide guidance on the interpretation of the Second Amendment. This would be particularly relevant if the judges in the Seventh Circuit displayed a clear disregard for the Supreme Court's previous statements and rulings. That's all for this video, folks. We'll see you next time.